Greetings all. So I am the aforementioned Greg Bledsoe. It's really nice to see that so many people stuck around this long. A lot of times when I present at the end of the day, you get empty rooms a little bit because everybody's like tired and leaving, and you guys are all motivated to stay. I appreciate that. So my talk is on using DevOps to identify, embrace, and drive exponential change, because that's the age that we live in. This is an absolute necessity. So it's not even really a matter of choice anymore. It's a matter of necessity. Adapt or die is always the maxim. But we have to do it at a speed now that is unprecedented. And that speed is only going to increase. You can look at basically the history of Western civilization and kind of chart the speed of change and the innovation cycle. And it has shortened dramatically. We have less time to adapt before even the change we were attempting becomes obsolete. So there's a number of ways to measure that, right? But change is normal. Change historically life is change. From the time an embryo is created by fertilization to the time that you basically decay and become part of the environment again, you're changing. That is life. Life is change. And yet at the same time, for odd reasons that nobody really understands, we're very change averse. We as human beings like things to stay the way they are. We call that the consistency bias. There's other names for it. That's the one that I usually use, the consistency bias. We like things to stay the same because it feels safe, because we understand it already. And we're sort of programmed by our cognitive biases to be a little bit afraid of the unknown. A very important thing to understand is that most of our cognitive systems were built for survival, worst case scenario. So we're designed to sort of make snap judgments and be very risk averse. Because if you have, say, a 51% chance of getting food and you're hungry, or a 49% chance of dying, you know, what do the odds of death have to be for you to pursue the food? Depending on how hungry you are, they still have to be pretty low, right? Because death is a pretty bad consequence, and that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, right? The human brain is a pattern matching system designed to sort of identify opportunities and threats, to take advantage of opportunities in a risk-averse manner and identify the threats and quickly assess the risk. The problem with these mechanisms that result in tribalism and result in all of these kinds of side effects, right? The problem is that we're not facing survival level events very much anymore in the Western world. Now, in parts of the world, they're still very much appropriate. But for us in the Western world, we've moved up Maslow's hierarchy of needs to the point where they're not as appropriate. And yet, we cannot just necessarily turn them off. We have to become aware of them first, and then we have to figure out how to correct for them, right? We want to classify things, we want to classify objects. And so that leads to stereotypes, and we sort of reason from patterns and stereotypes. It's just sort of kind of how we are. That's not super effective anymore, right? We have to train ourselves to think statistically, to think mathematically, to think economically. And when we do that, then we realize that even though we live in the age of the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, there's another Chinese proverb that also applies to us, that in chaos is opportunity. So while everyone else is stuck in all of these cognitive biases that are so risk averse, if we embrace the risk and the potential reward, because mathematically and economically it makes sense to do so, and it does, then we can gain a tremendous first mover advantage. We can gain a tremendous competitive advantage. The same competitive advantage, in fact, that Japan secured after World War II. And American manufacturing took decades to figure out why they couldn't do what the Japanese could do. So DevOps implementation right now is in the middle of that cycle of failure, where companies are trying to implement it by copying process example, and it fails, and they don't know why. So they just make more random changes that also don't work, but they don't know why. Now, the solution for this is to look the place you least want to look. This is always the tough solution this is why the consistency bias exists. Because if something we hold to be true turns out not to be true, and it means that we've been wrong a long time, this is very uncomfortable. But we have to embrace this. Because the sunk cost fallacy also applies. Just because we spent a long time investing in something doesn't mean it's worthwhile anymore. The moment we discover something is not worthwhile, we must abandon it. We must shift away from it. Now, this change cannot be made immediately, but it can be made much faster if you ask yourself the hard questions. Now, measuring the pace of change can be done in a number of ways. One is looking at the average lifespan of a company on the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 list, which is short now. So in 50 years ago, the lifespan of a Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company was 70 years on the list. Now it's about 10, which means that in about 10 years, about half of the Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 companies will turn over and be replaced. This is a rough world to live in, but it's also a really good world to live in, because all of those companies will be replaced by companies that are doing it better, faster, and have innovated on the business model. So companies that are stuck protecting markets are already dying. And there are tons of smaller, nimbler companies without markets to protect that are already feasting on their corpse before they're even done dying. Think about what the fintechs are doing to the big banks. Think about what's happening in the transportation industry with Uber. Think about, it's a rough world. It's a rough competitive world, and you got to stay on your game, because nobody's going to protect you. Nobody can. Even, no matter how big a moat you've managed to dig around your business model, whether that's physical infrastructure like right away in places where you can put cable and infrastructure in, right? Well, 5G is coming. Once 5G is here, the need for these cables is much, much less, right? Maybe your secret sauce has been shipping routes. Well, guess what? When I took off to come here, the Amazon Prime plane took off right next to me. What if they do what they did with AWS and open up their shipping as a product? Right? Nobody's beyond disruption. What if there's an Uber of package delivery? Right? Then all those shipping routes don't mean as much. So, first, some good news. Radical change is scary. But almost all of the mega trends in the world today are good. Here's an example. There are less percentage of people living in abject poverty today than ever before. And notice how this curve steepens. This curve, if this trend continues, there will be almost no one in the world living in abject poverty very soon. Almost any mega trend that you look at for the world overall is very positive. Here's two more examples. The number of people being killed in war is at an all-time low and continues to drop. It doesn't feel that way because we get 24-hour news cycles. I mean, some of the best things are things that are not happening, and nobody reports on those, right? When's the last time you said, breaking news, this country has been without war for 40 years, right? You don't hear about it until somebody starts shooting. So we have this, and our bias, remember, is very risk averse. So we gravitate to the bad news. Literacy. This is a very important point to the pace of change for reasons we'll get to in just a minute. Literacy is at an all-time high. And this change, the overall scope of this is exponential. We're seeing exponential positive change in the world. So radical change isn't bad, but it is scary unless you learn to embrace it. DevOps is actually a radical, revolutionary adaptation to the need to adapt to exponential change. So I'm going to say that again. DevOps is essentially a revolutionary adaptation to the need to adapt to radical exponential change. That's essentially what DevOps is. DevOps is a case study in how to adapt to exponential change, how to adapt to a world that will look as different from today tomorrow as today looks from 5 years ago. We have direct neural interfaces coming. We have so many amazing technologies just on the horizon that are going to radically alter the way we interact with technology and its usefulness and immediacy. So, do we embrace it, or do we wait till the last second to be dragged kicking and screaming into it? That's the question. Adapt or die is the maxim. So, if you can understand the trends that are playing into this exponential change, then you can predict how things are going to continue to change. Now, this is a little brief history of Western civilization in a chart. So you'll have this deck at the end, and this you know, you could look at this for a while and sort of continue to realize things. I made it, and I still realize new things when I look at it, and when I kind of sort of broaden my horizon to think about the whole scope. Right? Basically, this is the story of how societies have climbed Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as we worry less and less about safety and longevity, and as we have more and more information, we can spend more and more time optimizing our existence and creating technology and doing things that are way above and beyond survival, that are way that just add value to our existence by some measure that we have decided has value. So culture models, they're up in the corner you see, there's a culture model of holacracy. Holacracy is really interesting. I recommend you look at it. It's basically a way of picturing how cultures have changed over time. So over the course of history, we need to use power and fear less to hold groups together, right? Imagine primitive man, right? Neolithic times, starvation, accident, attack, deadly animals and predators, all constant. Your group had to be small enough that they could basically hear you shout. And you had to know that everyone was going to do exactly what you expect, even when you're not present, because the group's survival could depend on it, right? But now over time, as we climb Maslow's hierarchy of needs as societies, right, we get all the way up to green cultures, which are more prevalent now, which are, much more kind of egalitarian, right? Our societies are becoming more egalitarian. Our societies are becoming more about the value of the individual, are becoming more and more about voluntary interactions versus coercion, right? So it's time for business to follow suit. It's time for IT to follow suit. This is kind of what the DevOps movement has been leading us towards. Now, extrapolating this, right, you can come to a few conclusions. Here's one. The cost of entering markets has dropped to almost zero. Think about Uber. What did Uber need to get started? Because all they're doing is connecting people who want a ride to someone who needs a ride. There's really nothing for anyone they don't need anyone's permission. They don't need any physical inventory. They don't need anything from anyone, and they just can start. This is the way markets are now. Powered by the ultra-wide scale collaboration of the internet, and empowered by the collective brain power that we can apply to solving problems. And every layer of problem solving enables a new layer of problem solving. So much of the world today could not exist if the internet did not exist. And the internet is an extension of the immediacy of information dispersal that started all the way back in the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, you had the pamphlet and the printing press, and you could suddenly, and mail, and global trade routes, and suddenly you could disseminate information widely. You could have an idea propagate over the course of, say, a century or so. And the influencers, the people who are leading the way, could all collaborate, right? And so they could all apply their brain power. Now think about how we have exponentially increased that. We can learn from the experience of basically every other human being on earth. Why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we use that to collect best practices, to see what works and doesn't work? That's essentially what DevOps is. DevOps is an open source collaborative methodology, right? DevOps, basically what we have done is we're learning from everyone's experience. Someone did something and it worked, and we discovered, hey, our real problem is silos. And now, well, who can tell us how to break down silos? Well, there's this whole thing called lean thinking. And there's this all of this thinking out there. So we try things and we invest back together, and we all share our stories, and we have a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't work. So we're applying all this collective brain power, right? The smartest person in the world is not smarter than all the other people in the world combined. The smartest person in a room is not smarter than all the other people in the room combined, right? So the more brain power you can apply to problems, the better the solutions you can come up with. There's very specific mathematical reasons for that, which we'll get into at the end. So there's a convergence happening where the cost of entering markets is nearing zero, and the number of potential investors or innovators is approaching the entire population of Earth. As we eliminate poverty, as we increase literacy, increase access to technology, we're empowering almost the whole world to apply their innovations to the world's problems. Now that's pretty awesome, and that's going to lead to amazing change. The real problem with this is everyone who holds a legacy power base is at risk, is at extreme risk. And this is why my personal saying is, disrupt yourself or be disrupted. You can do it internally or you can do it externally. Now Amazon's the master at that. They're a great example. I don't really have time to go into that. But you can look at their example and how they continue to disrupt their internal products and internal profits to continue to turn out new things, right? That's the ultimate example. The moment a business moves from growing markets to protecting markets, they're already dying. Because when you're protecting the market, it can only shrink. And now you have this multi-front innovation war where you're being attacked by all these smaller, nimbler companies. It's not a formula for success. Mathematically, you can't win unless you do what they're doing better than they do. So whether you're the company wanting to take market share or the big company needing to keep market share, the same formula applies. Adapt or die. Embrace exponential change. So many examples, but got to move on here. So the net result of the last graph, cost of entering markets exponentially falling, number of potential innovators exponentially increasing, right? We see even on this chart. So this chart is already dropping each measure by an order of magnitude. And the curve is still exponential. Right? So how much faster is the world going to change from now on? Radically faster. Those who are best situated to profit from the change are the ones who will win in this new world. And it's going to take too many people suffering from the consistency bias, failing, and having to go figure out their life all over again before we finally figure out this is the new world, and it's not bad, it's just different. In fact, it's quite exciting. It's quite a world to live in, really, if you think about it. So here's an example of the pace of change quickening in a practical way. The frequency of innovation in production lines. Right? The first innovation in production lines that we can really identify was the invention of the automated flour mill in, 1790 or so. And then it took over 100 years for the steam-powered conveyor belt to come about. And then it was much less than that for the next innovation. And the next innovation came quicker and quicker and quicker. Now, think about the continuous delivery book was written. Think about how much DevOps has changed since 2010 in just 7 years. Think about, Jez Humble declined to give a definition of DevOps because it changes every day. So, I have a solution to that too. I have a definition of DevOps that will not change every day. But it's important, and I'll get to that in a minute, it's important to understand why we are the way we are. Why do we do things the way that we do? Right? So you have to imagine, think about the progress of culture, okay? So we come out of power and fear-based cultures where literally the Egyptians believed their rulers were gods. Things go forward in time, and then we get to sort of the European aristocratic kind of methodology where we believe that our rulers are ordained by God because they are somehow better suited to make decisions for everyone. Right? We're still kind of fresh out of that kind of thinking. Right? And in the middle of this thinking comes Frederick Winslow Taylor, who invents management, basically. And his management was built for unskilled workers delivering to static markets that did not change. And his idea was, these workers are basically like children. If we don't make them, they won't do anything. They'll just take our money and go home. That was kind of his idea. Kind of a very paternal view of workers. Management was the new aristocracy, basically. So this methodology was the only game in town. So everyone internalized it. And unfortunately, it's still internal. Now, this manifests in very particular ways that you will recognize when I show them to you. But it's very important to understand this is the past. And we must dig out this thinking if we wish to embrace the opportunities of a radical exponential change. So, Taylorism, bad. That's the main takeaway. Now along comes Edward Deming, the godfather of lean. Godfather of lean, agile, and DevOps. And he gives a totally new way to do it. So I'm going to have to kind of speed through this. I only have about 15 minutes left. But basically, the main contrast between Deming's work and Taylor's work is that Deming took an economic view of value, identified what prevents the delivery of that value, and worked to eliminate that waste, which is lean philosophy, right? But what Deming said, which we often forget, even a lot of people who are implementing lean thinking, is that he said the greatest waste was the waste of human potential through disengagement, discouragement, micromanagement, lack of purpose. People don't care about the outcome. And so they do the minimum. They game the system. So how do we embrace a world where people care about their jobs because they understand the organization's mission? Now think about this now. All the charts I showed you of how the world is improving, even though it doesn't feel like that because we focus on the negative, because that's just kind of how we're wired, those advances have come through the ability to more efficiently distribute goods and services. Free trade, free markets. That's the basic explanation. Voluntary interactions. So how do we adopt this in our business? Because our business management is all stuck in this aristocratic thinking. How do we get to empowered management? How do we get to applying the brain power of all the people that we have to the problems of our business. And that's the problem with trying to manage by decree or by fiat, is because the only one who cares about implementation problems with the fiat are the person who made the decree. If you want something to succeed, everyone has to see the value, because everyone's making economic judgments about the value of things. I propose to you that you should do something, you immediately, like unit test, and you immediately make a value judgment. If you don't see the value, you will make an economic judgment that the switching cost exceeds the value to you, and you will just game the system. Okay, I have to produce unit tests. I'll do minimal unit testing. I'll hit the metric, because that's what people do. Peter Drucker said, a man with a metric to meet will meet the metric even if it destroys the enterprise. It's very true. You want 75% unit testing, you'll get 75% unit testing. What is the quality of those tests? That's the real question. If they're not quality, they provide no actual value, and you're just producing overhead and waste. So what you have to do is actually convince people of the value of unit testing. That's a whole different game, because it has value. This can be economically demonstrated. Separate point. So these two models of management are completely incompatible. They come from a different set of philosophies and principles. So what is Taylorism? How does it manifest? Hierarchical silos. Everyone recognizes this, because this is the way we manage everything. This is how we have always done it, and our consistency bias demands we continue to do it this way, where we have all of these people who are only looking at the piece they touch. And if what I do here wrecks everything for everybody else, I don't care. This is why things like SQL injection still exist, because the developer doesn't care about security. That's not his job. But what if we're connected to the mission and the purpose of the organization, and we care about the outcome, and we feel like owners of the process? What if we get the security guy and the tester and the developer and the business person all in the same room, and somebody has the opportunity to say, hey, this looks like an opportunity for SQL injection that will really inhibit us fulfilling our purpose? That's a very different way to do things, isn't it? Now, it's not as easy. Fixing this is not as easy as realizing it, because we have habits. You can make people sit in the same room, but you can't make them start thinking. You can make people sit across from each other, but you can't make them talk. You have to create an environment where they want to talk. You have to create an environment where they're habitually thinking about what do we not know that we need to know to be successful in the first meeting, right? Feature refinement. Because that first meeting generally just gets burned, even in an agile environment where you have everybody in the same room. Nobody starts thinking about what they actually need to do to make this work, to provide the value, until a work item lands on their desk. It's a direct descendant of Taylorism. So in Taylorism, because we have the implicit assumption that decisions are best made by the betters, right? We want to make every decision at the highest level possible, right? So we try to deliver value like this. All this does is extract value, extract transparency, right? Because the person at the top can't have the right information, because he's getting the result of a game of whisper. By the time the information, even if it wasn't that everyone needed to satisfy their boss, they knew what answer their boss wanted and they gave them that answer, it's still a game of whisper. Have you guys ever played the game of whisper, where you line people up and one person whispers in one person's ears, and then they go through the chain and the last person says out loud what they heard, and it's totally different than what the first person said, right? That's a game called Whisper. It's really fun. I used to play it all the time as a kid. And it's very illuminating, right? That's what getting information up to the top of this chain is like. And then you introduce blame culture, where people are afraid to be blamed, and transparency is the first thing you lose, right? All of these are artifacts of this Taylorist, aristocratic management style. So then, our goal then becomes to deliver value like this. There are specific ways we do that today, right? This is something that you can achieve today, and you don't need to make organizational change. You need a minimal set of tools. You need a minimal rethinking of your practice, and you can start doing it like this, and then over time perfect it. That's possible today. You can do that. But this is not all that is possible. This is all people are really aiming for, but this is far from all that's possible. And what I want to propose is that if we want to adapt to exponential change, then we must go beyond this. Why do we have to go beyond this? Complexity. Information, the speed of information. So this was someone's attempt to create a complexity map of all the variables that affected the price of eggs in Ireland. So I left the labels off. You could never understand it. You could have 100 years to study it, and you would never understand it. And it changes. By the time you could even have an overall scope, it would be changed. I'm sure that by the time the guy finished making this, all the variables, even what the variables are, had changed, right? Now, this doesn't even include global complexity, like imports and exports, like weather in other areas of the world that affect egg production, like advances in production capability. None of that's even here, right? How can one person understand how to react to this? It's impossible. The idea that the CEO is the best person to filter all the information is just legacy, useless, worthless thinking. It's not true. No one is smart enough to manage the world. No central authority can process the information in real time to adapt to change. All they can do is try to stop change. That is responsible for a lot of the pathologies that we have in the world. The desire of people to stop change rather than embrace and direct change. Because unanchored change is very dangerous. Let me go back to this for 1 second. This process has not been without its hiccups, because change for change's sake is dangerous. Undirected, unanchored change. Think about the fact that in the 20th century, 200 million people were killed by their own governments because they wanted change, but it was unanchored change. They tried to also remove all of the societal superstructure that had produced our sense of things like morality and ethics. And it just didn't work. A utopian ideology is very dangerous because you always feel like you're just a few more murders from paradise, right? So this learning process here has always been not without its setbacks. But skill acquisition for a person in a society are the same. You have plateaus and even setbacks, right? The first time you do something, maybe it's really fun, but then you have to start thinking about what you're doing if you want to improve, and you get worse. And you have to stick with it, right? That's the story of human progress, individual and societal. So, where was I? So here it is. Here's the summary. Hierarchy is meant for control. Taylor's methodology was built for cost control and resource efficiency, which is the wrong way to adapt to continual change. So what is the right way to adapt to continual change? First of all, you have to dispense with the idea that you know what the future is going to look like. You have to dispense with the idea that there are certain people who are best suited to tell everybody what to do, right? Taylorism, you want to make every decision at the highest level possible. But in Agile, in Lean, you want to make every decision at the lowest level possible. And there's a reason for that, because that's where the accurate information is. Because that's where the real understanding of what's happening is. So you have to empower through decentralization. There are ways to do that. They're fairly well understood. People are going through Agile transformations all the time to try to achieve this. Now, people think that decentralization is anarchy. It just means no rules and everybody does whatever they want. But it isn't. Remember, we're not advocating for unanchored change. We're advocating for anchored change, where we have the goal in mind and we have kept it situated in the context of our superstructures that tell us how to do things, right? We're not embracing utilitarianism, where I could kill 9 people as long as it benefits 10. Or if it benefits 9 people enough, I could kill 10 people, right? That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we're anchoring this to our values, and our values are around the economics of providing something that contributes to our mission, contributes to our purpose. Every organization exists for a purpose. What is the purpose of the organization? Maybe you make strollers. How do you make better strollers? Right? Now, better strollers is not a trivial thing. Nothing that someone will give you money to do is a trivial thing. All of them improve the world, and doing it better makes the world a better place. Understanding that is critical. Selling the value of that is critical, and that anchors your change. So the Taylorist way, we throw things over a wall, right? And as a result, we get this kind of attitude. So in the new world, we want to do it a new way. That's a fundamentally different way of working and managing work. We've pre-negotiated what we're authorized and empowered to do. We're situated to react in real time as things change. We've created a structure to support that, right? So I mentioned I have a solution to the changing nature of DevOps definition. This is my solution. The realignment of IT around delivering business value. That will not change. This includes lean by reference. All of lean is now in this definition. So, this is not going to change every day. We can add things and take things away as we learn what works and doesn't work, and we still have a functional working definition. So, Jez Humble, your move. All right. So we have all of this body of knowledge now that's available. It's available to us from lean, from dimming, from agile transformations. We have all this body of knowledge, right? And now we have this, we don't even understand this yet, right? People are still failing to do this because they don't understand what this is, right? And Deming's forgotten lens. We talk a lot about the 3 ways of DevOps maps to 3 of these fairly well, but there's a 4th lens that we have kind of forgotten. Human psychology. What makes the difference between someone who comes in and punches a clock versus someone who actually cares about the outcome? We know the answer to that, but the answer is uncomfortable. But if we want to create a decentralized superstructure that can adapt to radical exponential change, then we have to get everybody plugged in. Whoever understands this first gains a huge first mover advantage, that this is the new way of the world. Google did a big study. I don't know if you're aware of it. Most people aren't. But they studied high-performing teams, and they found that the overwhelming difference between a high-performing and a low-performing team was the sense of psychological trust and safety. Why is that? Because only a small percentage of things you do will achieve what you think it will achieve. So you have to consider and try the maximum number of things to get to the small number of things that will work. And then you have to get among the things that will work, some are more optimal than others. Some are more efficient than others. Some work better than others. Some have benefits you didn't foresee. Some have drawbacks you don't foresee. So you have to do the maximum number of things. Mathematically, I came across an article that stated this, and it put such a fine point on it. The 10,000 experiment rule. There was an article by the same name by someone named Michael Simmons, And I was like, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. The 10,000 hour rule is basically the idea that you have to put in 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. 10,000 hours of deliberate practice will produce expertise because you've made basically every mistake that you can make. That's another definition of expertise, is that you've already made all the mistakes. Right? So the 10,000 experiment rule means that you've tried so many things, you've gotten to the ones that work. This requires a culture of metrics and a culture of economic reasoning, a culture of mathematical statistical thinking to know which ones are actually working. You have to know how to detect success and failure, which is a whole nother art form. But the 10,000 experiment rule can mathematically guarantee success. Now that's pretty awesome, right? Why wouldn't we embrace that? So, you have to do the maximum number of things, which means teams have to be empowered to try things. The best ideas don't come from above. They come from within. They come from the organization. So what does this mean? If I had to sum all this up, what am I actually saying? I'm saying that in times past, IT was the bottleneck that prevented the business from moving. But at this point, business is the bottleneck that prevents IT from moving. IT is now creating capabilities the business cannot consume. It's like, yeah, we can deploy whatever you want. What do you want us to deploy? We don't know. We don't have anything. We can't give you enough work to take advantage of these capabilities. But creating these capabilities can create the appetite to figure out on a more moving basis, what is it that the business actually needs to do? What is the innovation we actually need to deliver to the market? And how do we do that with more granularity? So this is happening. DevOps is the tip of the spear that moves the whole business, which is responsible, in my opinion, for the correlation between DevOps maturity and market success. Because DevOps is the tip of the lean thinking spear. You create capabilities that the business has to learn how to consume. Okay, now that we understand that, now that we can incorporate that into our thinking, we have a tremendous opportunity to go beyond DevOps. How do we create an organization that can adapt to exponential change? DevOps has already embraced a culture of experimentation and metrics and continual improvement, right? But the business hasn't. But we've shown the business that it works. And the business is the one generally holding us back because they can't let go of their rules, of the various structures that the pathologies we've developed in responding to the past. What we need is organizational therapy to dredge up the reason that these pathologies exist and root them out because they prevent us from adapting. This is the reason why we adults can go to therapy, and it's the reason why organizations need therapy. This is why Peter Drucker and Deming both believe that you should have outsiders come in and help you sometimes because you can't see your own forest for the trees. You can't spot the box that you're trapped in. So how do we solve this? Scaling to adapt to complexity. Scaling to adapt to much more rapid change. So everybody always asks me, when am I going to write a book? Well, I got half of it written in my head, and it's around this. Copying nature's solutions for scaling complexity. Applying that to business. You think your brain is in charge of your body. You think that as a human being, your brain is in charge, but it's actually not. Well, first let me establish, there's an analogy between an organization and a complex organism like a human being. And there's a particular analogy between a human being who is conscious and capable of directed self-change and an organization who is also capable of directed self-change. I'm almost out of time. This was the meat. I'm running it, so I'm going to give you the quick overview. But I'm going to develop this. I'm continuing to develop this. And the book is half written in my head. If anybody wants to publish it, let me know. Well, let's talk. But basically, the world is much more complex than we ever thought. And to get from a single-celled organism to a human being the mechanisms that are necessary to coordinate staying alive are far too complex for your brain to regulate with a single conscious stream of thought. And in fact, your single conscious stream of thought is always being affected by all of these feedback mechanisms between your body and the environment that you're totally unaware of. Your hypothalamus is always telling you what state of being you should be in. Are we at risk? Are we safe? Should I be on guard? Who's a threat? Who's an ally? Right? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? It's a very complex feedback mechanisms. Epigenetics. We didn't know about this not long ago, but when we discovered genes, we thought, once we know how genes are encoded and we can decode them, it'll be simple. It'll be a one-to-one mapping between genes and a protein, and the protein will do one thing. What we've discovered is that it's like there's a compression algorithm at play. It's almost like there's an encryption algorithm at play. And one gene does multiple things, and there are tons of feedback mechanisms that affect each gene that turn it on and off. We recently discovered that when we eat food, the DNA of the food becomes active in us and can change, like rice will change the way you metabolize cholesterol temporarily in ways that we don't understand. That's super fascinating, right? Also super complex. But these mechanisms, right? Your autonomous nervous system. Your organization has to develop an autonomous nervous system that is making decisions and handling things below the level of conscious thought. You have an executive leadership that maybe you trust to be the brain, right? And they can set strategy. They can decide on direction, but they can't keep it alive anymore because the environment changes too rapidly. So this is the basic idea, that we have to copy these ideas for scaling complexity. This is the way to survive in the new world. Nature already figured it out, and all we have to do is copy it. But first we have to understand it. It won't be easy, but it is doable, right? So that's my time. I want to thank you all for staying. I think very few people left. It's pretty late here. But I want to thank you so much. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I want your criticisms more than your praise, because I want you to tell me, what am I missing? How do I make this better? All right? Thank you very much.